Well, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. And hopefully my music will join us momentarily. Um, Welcome once again to my library and recording studio. Behind you. There's my music. If you don't know the piece is Handel, and it's called Royal Fireworks. And somehow it suits me when I have to talk about Hobbes and Locke, the nature of government. Behind me, you'll see the green drawing room, and me looking spastic apparently on there, which will stop once the music stops. I think it does. Behind me is the green drawing room at Windsor. I find it's an appropriate backdrop at the moment, and one that I just like and makes me feel good, as I have to do lectures late at night while everybody's asleep to get at any kind of peace. Today we're going to look at Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes is a critical feature of and thinker of political science. Many scholars will argue that political science, modern political science, begins not with Machiavelli, though he's certainly very realpolitik in his approach, that Hobbes is much more systematic, he's much more scientific, he is more on a theoretical basis, and the way that he tries to approach things, as we will see. So this video, we're going to look at Thomas Hobbes and his ideas. Video 2 for this week will be John Locke, and the third one will look at republicanism and Rousseau. So let's get started. As we look at Thomas Hobbes, Hobbes is an interesting character because he is going to be born in the year of the Armada, attacking England. So he's got his roots in the period of the Elizabethan Renaissance. He lives through the course of James I's reign, which begins in 1603 with the death of Elizabeth. And he is going to live through the death of and execution of Charles I. Just the execution of Charles I. And the Civil War. He's going to live through the Restoration. And he's going to live as he see, and by the 1670s, he's begun to see more problems happening. He is, in fact, going to be very much a royalist. Hobbes was a man who worked for the king, actually. He is going to serve as a tutor to both of James I's sons and to Charles to Charles I's sons, and is actually going to have to flee England with the royal party in the 1640s. His great work will be written in 1651. During the period of Cromwell being on the rise, during the turmoils that follow of the era of both the Commonwealth and the Protectorate for England. By 1651, Charles I has been executed for betraying his own coronation oath. And part of what he sees in the course of the Civil War is what's going to prompt Hobbes to write a rather long and involved treatise, but a thorough one, to look at the question of political authority and what it means, what government is about. And this book is called Leviathan, very biblical sort of name. He's drawing this, of course, from the book of Job, and where it talks about Leviathan. This is the frontispiece of the book, the original frontispiece, and you can see Leviathan there, and he's got all the various pieces that are symbols of government, from cannons to crowns to castles and churches even there, and you got a bishop's mitre. Interestingly enough, here on the front of this work, we get a crowned figurehead whose body is not covered in scales, but is covered with and composed of all the various little people that are part of his kingdom. It's kind of a graphic representation, rather creepily actually, of the body politic. Now he also has the shepherd's crook in one hand and the sword in the other, signifying both mercy and force that a ruler should have to use. Now, Leviathan's a fascinating work because in his own day, Hobbes is going to be accused of sometimes being an atheist. He's going to be accused of being completely secular in his argument. It certainly is a secular argument for absolutism. It's not based on the question of divine authority or divine sanction. There's no discussions of translation of divine authority or designation authority. None of that is going to actually be part of this. Instead, we're going to see very clearly a question of secular authority. Although at the same time, there are a lot of Calvinist elements to his argument. He was actually a religious man. He was Presbyterian. He was not Catholic like Charles I's sons will be, but he is a Calvinist. But the reality is he's not really talking about God. He doesn't talk about God there. So while you've got some very much Calvinist total depravity of man concepts that are very present here, we're going to hear some echoes of Augustine, in fact. He's not going to talk about God. And that's going to be the thing that's going to make most of his contemporaries very, very uncomfortable with what he has to say. Many scholars, as I mentioned, will consider him to be the father of modern political science. Certainly, we see this is often the birth of modern political theory, not the Prince. The Prince is very much bound by its own time, and a lot of its analogies are very much there. Although we talked about last time, there are some principles here that can follow through. Now, one of the things that's fascinating here is that he begins to give us the terminology and the methodology of how political scientists do things. How do you approach doing politics? And he's going to show us a little bit of both methods. He's going to talk about sovereignty. He's going to talk about definitions, and he's going to define these things in ways that, quite frankly, nobody else has. That's been a problem, actually, is that a lot of terms have been thrown around, but they haven't often been defined. And Hobbes is going to do that. Now, he defines sovereignty as the ultimate power, the final authority. Now, sometimes this is a word we struggle with. Well, if a state's sovereign, that means they can take care of its own business. No, what it means is that they have the final authority on something. If you're the sovereign, you're the final authority. And much as those who would like to say the Queen has no power in England, she is the final authority on many, many things. And one of the other pieces that he'll talk about very clearly is that the law is command, that the law is not something that is just always just or fair, but the law is about giving commands, which is a really interesting perspective for a guy who's coming from England. He's going to argue that covenants without swords are just words. They don't have any strength, that you need something behind it that makes one abide by it. Otherwise, why do you have this at all? And certainly there is a level of that, but he's also living in the 1650s, and he's writing this in 1651, in a period when, for the very first time in over 1,000 years, you've actually got a treaty between European monarchs that didn't involve the Pope as a signatory. The Treaty of Westphalia. The Treaty of Westphalia is signed in 1648, and the Pope is not a signatory. It's going to make religious decisions about the bodies politic of the Holy Roman Empire and other places, but the Pope won't be involved. So what is securing your treaty? Well, the threat of war by other parties. And for many European monarchs, the idea that they also gave their word to God at the same time. But he's actually not going to talk about how you might have given your word to God. He's going to be talking about this and this is why he's often seen as very secular. It's not that he's not a believer, but he leaves God over here and he talks about how it works whether or not one believes in God, that this is how these things work. And that's why you say you have to have this threat of force, particularly if you don't have the threat of God's wrath from the papacy. Now, he also is going to discuss the social contract. The social contract is an interesting piece here, and it's going to show exactly how he discusses more than one type of kind of methodology here that he's going to be using. Now, the social contract was, as we've seen, something that we could find elements of even in the ancient world amongst philosophers like even the Epicureans. But here, he's going to actually begin to give it some dimension and some depth and some definitions. And he argues that the social contract is what sets the scope and powers of the government that gives them such sovereignty and authority. And he says government gives life to the contract. The contract doesn't really exist without government. He's not really dealing with it in a theoretical sense. It's out there in kind of in theory, but at the same time, he's saying this is something that's palpable because you have government. Now, he argues that the state is not organic, very much contrary to the concepts of the body politic at the time. But he's going to see the state as a rationally constructed machine. Now, this is a really fascinating idea because it's operating in the same time frame. He's operating the same time frame as Galileo, and as Newton is going to be coming just a little ways off. The publication of the Principia Mathematica is in 1687, so we've got a few years yet. We've got about a decade. We've got a couple of decades between this work and that one. But we're already beginning to see in the works of Galileo on mechanics, and which will eventually culminate in the works of Newton, this idea that the universe is a machine rather than an organism. And he's going to see the same thing with the state, that it's a rationally, reasonably constructed machine, not organic. Now, the state of nature construct that he begins to deal with is a really critical one for political theory, and it shows up in lots of different places. And it does have its own sets of issues, as we talked about last time, in the fact that there isn't a nice, neat contract most of the time. So it makes it a little bit difficult. Now, for him, the social contract idea means that there is no civil society that doesn't have some sort of governing rules, okay? Now, you can have a society that doesn't have civil rules, but it's not a civil one. It's not a one that's actually operating on a certain level of civilization. Mankind's basic nature determines what kinds of governments you get. That's the kinds of governments you're going to have simply because of who we are. Now, here's where we start to hear the depravity of man argument, that he does not believe in man's better nature. He does not think that. He thinks man is inhuman. Man doesn't just have a little bit of inhumanity to man. Man is basically inhumane. That's what he thinks. Now, his ideas about social contract are actually going to be something that kind of combines with some of the things that we saw from Hugo Grotius as development of international law. He's going to set this idea that you have to have common governing rules to constrain mankind. Now, he uses two different methods, both of which are rather important for political scientists. The first is what we call the compositive method, and this is an arguing from first principles. Now, this is the method that you see in a lot of theorists, and you see it even to a degree in Machiavelli, that, okay, here's our principle, and this is what we need to go from that. Well, he's going to do some of that, but he's also going to use what we call the resolutive or deductive method, that we're going to see the principles from what's going on. We're not going to try and we're not going to start with how the ideal of society. We're going to start with what is and then deduce principles about what we need to do. And if it sounds a little bit like taking a survey and then reaching a conclusion, well, that's because that's what he's doing. He's applying the scientific methods that have already been written by Francis Bacon to political ideas. Now, in his method, he uses both methods, but he also uses a couple of different approaches. Once again, ones that are very critical to how political science still operates. The first of these is nominalism. Now, nominalism was something that was not new to him. It was certainly around in the Middle Ages. We've talked about it a little bit already with Aquinas. That nominalism for him means that the truth and principles are a function of language, not in the material world. He's going to talk a lot about words. And he's going to talk a lot about definitions. And he's going to say, now, that doesn't mean that this is, he's going to talk about how the words themselves, by saying these things this way and shaping them, are about the language. And once again, he's echoing Bacon, okay? Bacon's Idols of the Mind, okay? That language can trick us into thinking things different ways. That's not necessarily how things are. And so you get this concept about when you're naming things, are in fact you reflecting reality, or you trying to shape it? You need to understand the concept by defining it, describing it. Don't just give it one word, because one word isn't sufficient, because different people can use nominalism in different ways. So you've got to describe it, okay? In other words, that's how you get meaning, not by one word, but by many. Now, he's also going to be very much a materialist. He is not, once again, he's not interested in ideals. He's not interested in utopias. He's not interested in the perfect, just republic or abstracts. He's interested in this world and how it works. And he's very much, this is the materialist. He's almost the anti-Plato, okay? That Plato's only interested in the realm of the forms, and Hobbes is only interested in the material world. And I'm too much of a kid of the 80s, and I'm starting to hear Madonna in my head. Okay. And yes, this is something that's going to show up in other philosophers like Karl Marx and others who are going to be materialists. He sees the physical world, mass, body, energy, motion, as the keys to how the world works and how political entities work. And that he believes the state can be described by mathematics, and that physical truth is mathematical, not linguistic. Okay, linguistic is descriptive over here, but that's not sufficient. You need mathematics to describe it. Now, I'm going to put a pin here, because this is how there's a lot of political scientists who work like this, who want to go mathematical and want to go the quantitative route. And that's very, very effective. But just like Aristotle would have said, there's also another method. There are some things that cannot be effectively described by mathematics. Don't tell Hobbes that, okay? But Hobbes is, like I say, Hobbes is living in the world of Francis Bacon's scientific method. He's living in the era of Descartes and Descartes' Cartesian dualism, where he's dividing things and graphing the world, okay, and coming up with mathematical proofs of things, including God himself, okay. That's the kind of rationality that he's living in, and that's what he's going to apply to political science. Now, what does he say along the way? Well, he's going to see materialism and nominalism both at work in human nature, that we have this innate need to name things, but the reality is that all that really matters is the material. And he sees that he's going to get his theory of human nature by applying Galileo's physics to, in fact, humanity, okay? Much like you'll get later thinkers try to apply Darwin to humanity, okay? But he's going to come up with very different results. He thinks that humanity is composed of both involuntary and voluntary motion. There are some things we have control over, some things we decide, and some things we just do without really thinking about it. And that involuntary is going to be leaning more towards the material. He says knowledge and language is motion in the brain, okay? I said, he's not against these things. He still thinks that he likes the quantitative more, but he's still going to use the qualitative because he's going to be defining language. You need these things to understand. And knowledge creates this nominal conceptualization, this understanding of the world. And he argues that will is the active desire that drives humanity, that creates the motion in humanity, that the will. And this, we can hear all kinds of ideas about the will. And here we go. We can hear Liz is going, that sounds Augustine. There we go. Yes. We could also go pull things like Mein Kampf. Okay. He's going to talk about the will. Okay. This is going to be something that he's not alone in some of these ideas. They show up in other places again. But he says that the intellect is what determines what is the maximum pleasure versus pain. And we start to hear Epicureans here, and Hobbes knows who these are. He does not think that you have free will. Told you, Calvinist. Okay. He thinks that your passions are involuntary. And knowledge and language are more voluntary, and you can create create knowledge and create concepts, and all of that is your voluntary motion. But all of these the will and the passions are involuntary, and those are harder to stop. In fact, he doesn't think you can. And that brings him to what he thinks man is like in the state of nature. Okay. He believes in the material, the physical that drives man, and that while man has this intellect that can gain knowledge and things, that's not going to be sufficient to really stop, in fact, the passions. Passions are going to be driven by passion. So that brings us to man in the state of nature. And he believes that there's no law in the state of nature, moral laws or immoral laws in an absolute sense. He doesn't think there's anything such thing as a moral or an immoral law. He just thinks there's law, and law is about force, nothing else. Okay. And in the state of nature, he says there's none. There's no law. There's no government. And he says that man in the state of nature is free, but freedom here is merely freedom from restraint. He doesn't see there's such a thing as moral freedom because he doesn't think man has the ability to have free will in the face of his passions. Equality for him is everyone having the right to everything. Not equal opportunity, not equal opportunity before the law or equal treatment, but everyone has the right to get everything. And that means that they have the right to take it from you. So there's no restraints in the state of nature, and that power governs all actions of mankind. In other words, our passion to have whatever it is that we want. Okay, that's what he says. Power governs all our actions. So therefore, intellect can create all these concepts and everything, but intellect is powerless in the face of the material drive that is going to basically create all of man's actions, particularly in the state of nature where there's no restraint. So here's where the social contract comes in. Because life is all about power, and that power governs all reactions, and life is about the passions and how they're driven, then life in the state of nature is going to be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Because the strongest are only be the ones who survive. Everybody else is going to be beat up to take whatever they have. And they're not going to last long. Not unless they're crafty. But even if you're crafty, somebody can come along and beat you up. So you're going to have to be by yourself. You're not going to have much. It's going to be brutish, meaning it's brute force. And you're not going to live long. It's pretty much awful. That's life in the state of nature from Hobbes. And he says it's so bad that people begin to decide that, we need something else better than this. We're going to lay down our powers, our rights for a measure of security. Now we can insert our Benjamin Franklin here if you want, because he's going to disagree with Hobbes, but we'll get there in a little while. And he says that when the people lay down their rights, their powers to control their own destiny, that freedom to do whatever they want to do, the state becomes sovereign. They give that over to a state, the Leviathan. Now that Leviathan now has all of the powers that were once in all the individuals. He has it all. And the social contract for Hobbes is unbreakable, because if you break this, you simply go straight back to solitary, poor, nasty Brutus. In short, you gave it all up, or somebody did in time immemorial, and created the Leviathan. There he is again. As far as he's concerned, no right of resistance is retained, because that would simply negate the whole transaction and create the state of nature again. Now, for Hobbes, monarchy is the absolute best form. Okay. Now, he says there's nothing wrong with having democracy or partial democracy or limited monarchy. He says that's fine, but a monarchy is the best form. And he says it's that because monarchy is going to create a system of stability, even in times of crisis. Okay. But he says it can be democratic. But don't misunderstand, constitutional rights, such as having a parliament or being able to vote, do not limit the power of the government. Even if you've written a constitution, that's not going to change the power of the government. Rights are granted by the government and can be reclaimed at any time. Okay. And there's a lot of questions there. And you can see why some of our founders build in some of the protections that they do, and why even in the midst of warfare, we have to have an election. There's no real ability to suspend an election in the face of a problem. The British can do that, but we can't. And the reason we can't is because we see that as giving too much power to the government. They believe that he believed very much, Hobbes did, that that a sovereign would not have to exercise force if they governed well. Now, at this point, we start to hear Machiavelli over here that, government's it's about force, but if you do it right, you won't have to do this a whole lot. You should prepare for war, but you shouldn't have to if you're doing it correctly. Well, Hobbes has read Machiavelli, and on that point, he agrees. There are some problems, because he doesn't think that this monarch can unify people in the time of crisis. This is the problems with Hobbes's kind of system. His Leviathan has no connection with the people. He's apart from it, which is part of the problem Charles I faces, that he's not connected with the people, and he doesn't really want to be, and he doesn't think he ought to be, which is going to create problems with the population. And that makes it difficult to unify your population, okay? And the other problem is with his system of Leviathan, very few people have any sort of stake in the system, and there's no higher purpose to the system other than force. That's kind of the difficulties of Hobbes' system. Now, but remember that Hobbes is working out of a system in which there is a civil war, the execution of a king, and the system that he sees coming back after that, where he doesn't really revise Leviathan. He sees also there's no real right of resistance, because that's going to cause even more problems. Now, Hobbes is not going to live through the glorious revolution where England's going to change its government, one form for another form, with very, very little bloodshed. Locke, on the other hand, will live through that, and that's to whom we turn next.